Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. I'll start with my regular disclaimer here that just because I know about something in history doesn't mean that I can't still learn about it. As usual with these types of episodes, I knew about this issue, but I still had a lot to learn, and I'm glad you're here to learn along with me. When I was a child, my family used to take summer vacations that were the same every year. We would drive up to see my father's family in the Midwest, then do the drive east to the coast to see my mother's family there. I still remember driving through Georgia and knowing that we would eventually stop at one of those many roadside produce stands to buy a paper bag full of peaches from a local vendor. They were huge, ripe, and juicy and sweet. It was impossible to eat one without making a wet, sticky mess. So we would stand there beside the car at a rest stop with peach juice running down our faces and onto our shirts, and then we would clean up before piling back into the car and hitting the highway again. I grew up in Florida, which is an incredibly flat state, geographically speaking. So as we drove further north, I'd get excited to see the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Smoky Mountains. Sometimes it was hard to tell if I was looking at mountains or clouds on the horizon. When my dad was younger, he would drive straight through. Sometimes he'd try to sleep in the passenger seat while my mother took over, but it's still a feat considering we were driving from Orlando to a small town called Pacific Junction, Iowa, more than 20 hours away. Occasionally, we'd stop overnight at a motel. But I remember many nights on those summer drives, sleeping in the back of a car, waking up, laying down, looking out the window, and seeing the night sky. If I'm honest, I much preferred my dad's family to my mom's. And that's not an indictment of the people, but just the dynamic. My mother's family was loud, boisterous, second-generation Italian-American. Some of my relatives I loved. Others I dreaded seeing. It wasn't any person or group in particular. It was just that I was more of an introvert. I remember taking off on my own a lot and exploring the big house or walking down the streets or going to the back of the driveway where there was this big crabapple tree. But the fun things to do that we all did as a group were all these high energy and probably intended for kids a little older than I was at the time events. Boardwalk at the beach, Atlantic City, very exciting stuff. But I wasn't a kid that was all that into excitement. It felt like being a rag doll dragged all over into situations where I never felt comfortable or at home, where there were always big crowds. Compare that to pulling up to the rural, old, antique schoolhouse converted to hobby farm that was my paternal grandparents' place, where I was 100% in my element. Chickens, a cow, corn. Back then they raised corn. Today, if you drive those same roads, you'll see sorghum and soybeans, although when I Google it, it says corn is still the main crop. It just wasn't what I saw driving through the last time I went up there on my own. At any rate, I remember riding horses and ponies around the property, feeding the animals, finding Native American artifacts while I was out walking on the land, and shucking peas for my grandmother on the front porch. Rhubarb would grow on one side of the house, and always at least one rhubarb pie. Not strawberry rhubarb, but straight rhubarb. My father, growing up there, had a hunting rifle while he was still a boy. He started smoking cigarettes in grade school and only finished high school with a GED before running away to join the Army. The high school was so small, he would tell me, they didn't have enough people for a football team, so they only had a basketball team. The town was so isolated that my father once asked his Army buddies what they were listening to on the radio. When they told him it was the World Series, he asked them what that was. He was born in 1929, a child of the Great Depression era. I thought he'd grown up on a farm, the farm that my grandparents kept. But he told me he was raised in town. Every payday, my grandmother would tell the kids that she was going out. She would check the local watering holes looking for my grandfather, who was sure to be drinking that paycheck away. Both my father's parents were very loving toward me. However, my father's childhood was riddled with both physical violence and emotional abuse. Additionally, he was embarrassed by his clothing, which was sparse, ill-fitting, and in need of repair, because his family didn't have the money to replace it when it wore out. This would have been around the 1930s and 40s, after the economy had crashed. In the 2020 census, Pacific Junction had a listed population of 96. Not 96,000, literally just 96 people. And in its heyday, yes, it had a heyday, it contained a whopping 700. That may not sound like much, but it's a full 7 times the population it's got today or had in 2020. For scale, think of New York City with over 8 million residents, and imagine that 100 years ago it had 56 million. 700 versus 96. They are both tiny numbers for any modern city, and even a lot of not modern cities. But that's a huge population decline, again, looking at it from a percentage standpoint. As you might have guessed from the name of the town, Pacific Junction, this was a railroad town, and my grandfather worked on the railroad, although I have no idea in what capacity. I just remember that he was given a pocket watch when he retired that my dad kept under glass in the main bedroom of our home. It was the railroad work that attracted residents. It was a railroad town. It was established by the railroad in 1871, and in 1882 it was incorporated. However, the town became the site of the Burlington Railroad strike of 1888. The Burlington Railroad system was huge and profitable. When I read about the event at the Wiki, it was eerily similar to what we're seeing today economically as corporate profits hit record highs and people struggle to afford groceries and housing because wage increases aren't keeping up to the cost of living increases. The company's president in the late 1880s, Charles Eliot Perkins, made pricing agreements with his competitors in order to inflate shipping rates and also to suppress wages. He claimed wages were set by market principle of supply and demand, and this philosophy pitted him against things like collective bargaining and unions. 3 prongs of the railroad workers came together to demand higher wages, seniority rights, and grievance procedures. Hardly an extreme request. But Perkins responded by bringing in strike breakers and the Pinkertons. Several workers were murdered, and all of the striking employees were threatened with termination if they didn't return to their jobs. The strike was ultimately not successful. Good news, though. The railroad was able to pay its investors a healthy 8% return throughout the 1880s, so the capitalists made their money. Although the railroad reduced its connections in Pacific Junction, it wasn't actually the demise of the industry that wiped out the town. In the interest of full disclosure, in 2019, the levees in Mills County failed, and the town was flooded. Rather than rebuild, the federal government bought out the residents, and since then the town has limped along without a post office or other necessary infrastructure, with only 20% of the pre-flood population remaining. The high school had already been closed in 1986 before the flood event. There have been about 2,000 company towns in the U.S. over the years. Some have been run like prison camps, while others have promoted paradise-style living in line with the visions of their company owners. Some modern tech companies have toyed with the idea of rebooting the company town as a solution to housing becoming less affordable. In fact, in an article as far back as 2017 titled "Google and Facebook Are Building the Ultimate Perk Housing," Medium author Luke Stengel writes the following, quote, "The lengths companies will go to attract the best and brightest are unprecedented. Many new employees have the expectation that their employer will compensate them extremely well, but will also operate private transportation shuttles to get them to work, feed them 3 organic chef-prepared meals a day, and provide them with on-site services ranging from haircuts to doggy daycare to doctor's appointments. It is not surprising then in hot markets that accompany the healthiest economic ecosystems that housing might be seen as the ultimate amenity. It certainly is becoming an obstacle, if not the biggest obstacle, to hiring in these locations." End quote. However, he also goes on to say, quote, "Of course the factory town isn't a new concept. Mill towns and other company towns proliferated across the U.S. and Europe during the Industrial Revolution and into the early 20th century. During that period, companies began to become more paternalistic, providing not just jobs but housing, healthcare, schools, libraries, churches, and stores. This generosity was less altruistic than strategic. Companies could improve working conditions while deterring workers from activism and unionization." Unquote. I did try to look more into what Facebook and Google are doing, but I didn't find any solid evidence that company towns had been or were being built. So what I'm about to say is not directed at either company, but to the concept of company towns generally. Today, it's illegal to fire employees for unionizing or striking. But we all know that in a work setting, there are endless creative ways to downsize or make someone's life hell in the workplace without breaking any laws. In a past podcast, I mentioned a car company that said it might have to move its production facility to Mexico if U.S. production becomes too costly. Tell me you'll fire your employees for collective bargaining without telling me you'll fire your employees for collective bargaining. We can't legally fire you, but we could close the plant and reopen it somewhere workers don't expect to be treated as well as you do. It's a problem that is very much still with us. We like to think of these things as being in the past, but is it any less scary to lose your healthcare access than your housing? None of the things human beings need to survive should be so intrinsically tied to employment, with for-profit corporations with every motivation to increase profits and suppress costs for labor. But the company town isn't just a way to informally intimidate employees who may decide to advocate for higher wages or better working conditions with loss of their homes, loss of their health care, loss of everything else the company dangles to new hires as perks and benefits. The company town is also a way to enrich for-profit corporations even further. The cost of housing is inflated right now. So a company decides that rather than pay employees $2,000 a month to afford rent or mortgage, they're going to build housing at cost and then rent it out to employees at a discounted rate of, say, $1,000 a month. If I'm out of work and I'm looking for a job, this is a huge reason to want to work for this employer. My housing costs will be greatly reduced, and my employer doesn't have to pay the extra money for the inflated housing. Yes, they're building housing, but that's an investment because the company, reduced rent or not, will always be the landlord. That $1,000 I pay in rent, that discounted housing for me, is just me handing over part of my paycheck back to my employer, so they can potentially pay me less and have me give part of my paycheck right back to them and justify it by telling me that it's a perk for employees. Additionally, though, these communities aren't just housing. They might have healthcare facilities, stores, restaurants, schools, dry cleaning, even churches, on and on and on. The company can literally provide everything and make it so easy for me that I never have to leave my corporate community dream world because everything I need is right there. But what's the problem? It sounds great. It also saves taxpayers if we let for-profit corporations shoulder the burden of these social safety nets, right? It's a win-win-win. Employees get a pile of perks, the taxpayers don't have to worry about unhoused people, companies are able to attract and retain employees. It's a perfect solution. Until it isn't. What happens if you lose your job? What happens if you end up on disability? What happens if your company downsizes? What happens if they decide that in spite of you all being model employees, they'll just save so much more money moving the operation to Mexico or Chennai? What if a company goes under or folds for whatever reason? The billionaire who bought it as a fun hobby company decides it's boring now and he wants to move on to something more interesting. None of these workers would be the owners of the homes they live in. They wouldn't just lose their income, they'd lose everything. And it's possible they've foregone higher wages justified by all the perks and benefits that were only accessible to them for as long as they were employed with this employer. Unlike a government program put in place to serve citizens, that is citizen-owned and run for service, not for profit, a corporation can pull the rug out at any time for a lot of legal reasons and destroy thousands of lives in the process without answering to a constituency. And in U.S. history, this has happened. Towns have folded over robber baron whims. The wealthy investors, CEOs, and executive layers go on to find another position or investment, and the thousands of workers are instantaneously destroyed. Another example is the town of Pullman, Illinois. You may recognize Pullman as another famous railroad brand. Pullman set up a company town and used it to attract black workers from the Jim Crow South in the early 1800s. I'm sure they came looking for a better life. But in 1894, there was an economic downturn and Pullman slashed wages. Pullman did not, though, lower their rents or other community costs to compensate. This led to a strike that involved more than 250,000 workers in 27 states. And in what is becoming my normal fashion, I want to give this as another example of how the line between public and private is a fantasy. The strike broke when the government issued an injunction against the union, against the strikers, using the fact that some cars carried U.S. mail as their stake in the situation. Then President Grover Cleveland sent in the military to break the strike. By the end of it, 30 people had died, and it ended up costing the company millions of dollars and many months of disrupted rail traffic. But what also came out of this was the U.S. national holiday known as Labor Day, and the first African American labor union was created in 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was formed because the American Railway Union, which organized most of the Pullman employees, refused to include black workers. It's also worth noting that eventually, what also came out of this was that in 1937 the first collective bargaining agreement was secured between a union of black workers and a major U.S. company. It increased wages and reduced weekly hours. Some of the key players involved went on to promote civil rights and influence federal policies such as the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was a Pullman porter, Edgar D. Nixon, who was largely involved in a bus boycott that followed the 1955 arrest of Rosa Parks. Since his work with Pullman often had him working in other parts of the country, he enlisted a young minister to organize the boycotts while he was away, Martin Luther King Jr. It's amazing how interconnected all of these struggles are, and sad that they're never resolved sufficiently so that we can see an end to the root cause. The robber baron mentality keeps coming back to revisit the same violence, and over we fight the same battles instead of addressing the root cause of having a wealthy and powerful thin slice of our society maintain control over public resources needed to survive and thrive. If we don't find a way to take back what should belong to every one of us, this will never stop. It's easy to view this as history, but as the saying goes, if we don't learn from it, we'll just keep repeating it. This saying has never meant so much to me as it has since I've been aging. More and more, I see things I thought were lessons learned from the past being repackaged and offered up as new and improved. But the truth is, they're the same dangerous situations we've seen before, with the same risks and problems. People, though, who come a few generations later, don't remember them as clearly, or at all. And so we rinse and repeat our same mistakes. Not long ago, a young friend of mine reached out to say that he'd seen an article about Snailbrook, a housing project that Elon Musk was taking on that would supply housing to employees of his companies. I don't know a lot about it, and honestly, this episode isn't about this housing project. It's about that saying that if we forget history, we're doomed to repeat it. No matter what pretty colors we paint it. My friend was describing a company town. Musk's companies are by no means the first companies to use this model. We have had company towns in the U.S. since the pre-Civil War era. U.S. Steel operated a number of these communities tied to their subsidiaries, U.S. Coal and even Coke, as in Coca-Cola. While I recall reading about these in my history lessons in school, as is often the case, I'm no expert on this phenomena. I just know that they included things like company stores that were notoriously predatory against the workers. So I'm going to be looking into company towns and reading up on them and sharing with you what I find. As usual, if you know more about this, feel free to share your resources and information in comments. So I told my friend why I didn't think this was a good idea. Currently, in the U.S., we have a lot of our healthcare access tied to the ability to afford health insurance, which, if it's good insurance, a lot of people can't afford unless it's subsidized through an employer. For a lot of people living or working abroad, the idea of private employers operating healthcare access for citizens sounds bizarre. And it is bizarre. But we seem to be unable as a nation to get on board with providing medical services to citizens out of a sense of community and social welfare. And we'd rather use it as both a carrot and a stick to coerce employees to find and cling to working for a company that can provide those benefits that a lot of other countries view as social benefits that a government should be responsible for. A person who has a good job with good health insurance that isn't sucking up too much of their paycheck may seem fine. But the problem comes in if they want to or need to quit work, because they will lose their health insurance and with it, healthcare access. It's true that the Affordable Care Act under Obama alleviated some of this, but it's still the case that our for-profit healthcare is run through a for-profit insurance company. This means we pay more to cover the profit layers of two industries, healthcare, and health insurance. Lose your job or leave your job, and suddenly you're looking at an increase in insurance costs and limited access to healthcare as a result. Additionally, as we've seen with companies like Hobby Lobby, some employers seek to use the fact that they are providing their employees health insurance options to saddle their employees with their personal owners' ideologies. Hobby Lobby can literally, legally deny coverage to their employees for reproductive care, including contraception, because the owners are aligned with an ideology that does not allow the use of contraception. I'm not picking on Hobby Lobby here, it's just that their case made a lot of headlines, and it's one that folks in the U.S. are very familiar with if they follow these sorts of things. PBS, the public broadcasting service here in the U.S., has an interesting section on their website with oral histories. I'll link it in the description, but it includes recorded oral histories, and in one of those posted at their section on company towns, Bobby Clayton, a former company town resident, explains how the towns often included churches because the employers really wanted their workers to engage with religion. Another part of infrastructure that existed in these towns were schools, and while the schools were sometimes considered good schools, imagine Hobby Lobby running schools for their employees and what their science or history curriculum might look like. Here in Texas, we fight the battle over school curriculums regularly, and I recommend the documentary The Revisionaries to anyone who has the stomach to watch it. But the point is, what if a religious extremist employer were the only one in charge of your child's school curriculum? These towns often had to be out in the country in rural settings where the work was being done, and this precluded being near city or town infrastructure. This is why the companies were setting up so many things that a community would need. In addition to housing and schools and religious structures, they also set up recreational areas and stores where goods could be purchased. In fact, Willie Mays, a famous U.S. baseball star, learned to play baseball in Westfield, Alabama, a majority black company town. And yes, if you're going to ask employees to come and work in camps far away from any resources and facilities, they're going to need those things. I get it. I'm just saying that the end result was a huge power imbalance that generally did not break on the side of labor, but rather powerfully on the side of the owners. But the more benefits your company supplies, the more reliant employees become on employers, the more bargaining power employers gain, and the more the employee loses. It's bad enough to be afraid that you won't have access to affordable health care if you lose your job, even if you're healthy. Not even thinking about somebody with costly medical needs such as a sick spouse or child or support for disabilities. But imagine that your house is owned by your company and only accessible to you if you have that specific job. Who wants to be dealing with the loss of a job and loss of health care on top of being evicted in the same blow? Company towns ranged from horrible situations that are often referred to as continuations of U.S. slavery to situations that sounded somewhat better. But the fact is, even the best of intentions, or the most beneficial of these models, still serves, wittingly or not, to leverage a great deal of power in the job market to employers at significant disadvantage to employees. There's an old U.S. folk song written in the 1940s called 16 Tons. The chorus of the song goes as follows. You load 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. The song is about the struggles of coal miners in Kentucky. The idea behind this chorus is that this coal miner is working hard while living in a company town and still going into debt so deep that after he dies, no one should bother St. Peter to come and collect his soul, because even after death, that final aspect of him, his soul, will be the property of the company store because he's so in debt to the very company he's working for, which is paying his wage. This sounds counterintuitive, I know. In fact, I Googled to find out what the rent was in the 1920s, and it was about $60 a month. In one of the PBS videos, a company town resident recalls their rent was between $2 and $4 a month, and that the town's schools were turned over to the county in the 1930s, which I would guess was when the town was dissolving as a company concern. If that's the case, then their rent for the time was significantly less than average, and the head of the house is employed full-time. It sounds like a situation that could save someone a lot of money and allow them to put money away in order to ultimately pursue other things if that's what they want to do. But it didn't work that way a lot of the time. Employers wanted to keep their labor, and in order to maintain this, they sometimes paid their employees with company scrip. This practice became illegal in 1938 in the U.S., but the idea was that you were paid in what was basically monopoly money that your company put out. And since you had everything you needed right there on site in the company town, everyone and everything in that town ran on this company scrip. The store took it, you paid your rent with it, and so on. So this was the setup. You labor all day long, and they pay you in scrip they produce. You then pay rent to your landlord, who is your company that owns the house, and you buy your food or your medicine or anything else you need from suppliers in town, who are all owned by your company that owns them. So your wages all go right back to the company. And you couldn't leave because all your earnings were in scrip that was useless outside of your company town. Travel to the nearest city or town and try to use this money, and it wasn't accepted. So you were locked in and fully dependent on your employer for literally everything in your life. Again, this is why a lot of people viewed it as a continuation of U.S. slavery in some regards. But that's not even the cherry on top. The employer could then raise prices on staples sold at the company store and force you to pay more and more and end up using credit until, as the song says, you're basically working to pay off your debt to your employer. And you know I Googled company scrip, right? Nothing seemed surprising until I got to the wiki section titled Modern Practice, where it said that in 2008, the Mexican Supreme Court of Justice ruled that Walmart of Mexico, the Mexican Walmart brand, had to stop the practice of paying its employees in part with vouchers redeemable only at Walmart stores. I mean, wow. I guess if you can't do it in the US, then do it where you can? I think this may also be a good example of why regulation is necessary. It's easy to think this is the past and we don't do things like this anymore, but the fact is, we do. We just don't do them where it's illegal, but give a company a chance and they'll do it, even in the modern age. And this is why I find the idea of any modern company suggesting a company town as sketchy. They may have good intentions, but you know what they say about good intentions. And if you don't, it's that the road to hell is paved with them. I have worked for companies that were bought out and merged. The same company that's a great place to work is one change of management away from becoming a horrible place to work. What happens when the good-hearted paternalistic employer dies or has to sell or downsizes their portfolio and the company and employees end up under new management that isn't so benevolent? Now they're completely at the mercy of horrible and heartless leadership with everything they own at risk. And sure, this can happen with governments and regime changes as well. I literally used the Texas school system as an example of how that can also go wrong. But it takes a lot more effort than buying a corporation. And this is also part of why, in the current system we have, where labor is its own layer of the socially stratified, monetized society, something like a union is so important. If employees can't bargain collectively, they're screwed. If you walk off your job, your company goes on as usual. But if your company lays you off, you are an individual alone in the world who has just lost your income, the thing that provides you with access to every resource in your life. If you're most people, you're screwed if you can't find another job in short order. I remember seeing something not that long ago that suggested that everything in our economy is always about competition until it comes to labor. If there's a shortage of labor, we get angry at labor and blame people for not working. We call them lazy and entitled. That's the one area where we don't look at employers and say, hey, it's marketplace competition. If you can't find workers, better get to work competing for them. Maybe start by raising wages. Our social messaging even gets folks in the labor sector to criticize other folks in the labor sector, rather than asking the capital or corporate sector to do better at attracting labor. Anyway, I came across a list of company towns that still exist today in the U.S., and I was curious in what forms they still exist. Hershey, Pennsylvania was a company town founded by the chocolate magnate Milton Hershey in the early 1900s. When I read the wiki article about it, something struck me as not right. The article reads more like PR at a site set up to honor the Hershey family. In fact, a lot of the initial hits I got on Google painted Milton Hershey and the Hershey family as glowingly philanthropic. I tend to see charity as a symptom of a government failing to meet social needs. And when I see a wealthy philanthropist, I am always suspicious of where that money came from, what social programs didn't get funded so he could build his own town, how much labor was exploited and shifted into his pockets for him to amass that kind of wealth. I found a chocolate lover's blog, of all things, that featured a story on Hershey's legacy entitled "Too Sweet to Be True." Like the wiki article, it mentioned a lot of the things that Milton Hershey had built that he's often praised for. But they also included a story Hershey often told himself that illustrates why philanthropy. Quote, "He met a man on the street who didn't have the fare to ride the trolley. Milton Hershey gave the man the nickel, knowing that the fare box was essentially his own pocket. Once the man got on board the car, Hershey had his money back. The tale, which Milton told with pride, revealed the genius in the system he had built. It was a businessman's version of a perpetual motion machine." Unquote. The article's author then goes on to say, quote, "The story of this interaction characterizes Hershey's true motive behind what outwardly seemed like benevolence and generosity: personal gain. Since Milton Hershey ultimately held a monopoly on services and owned many buildings in the town, residents were essentially forced to play into his system. Even when he appeared to selflessly help a resident, Hershey evidently knew that helping others would ultimately benefit himself in a society where he essentially acted as ruler. End quote. Before listing their citations for the article, the author sums it up like so, quote, "A key moment that illustrates the length Milton Hershey went to deceive people and maintain his positive persona while actually serving his own agenda was his handling of a factory strike in 1937. Thousands of farmers, joined by loyal employees, stormed the factory and assaulted the strikers with fists, shoes, clubs, improvised weapons, and even ice picks. Although the violence against strikers was initially reported to be a spontaneous event orchestrated by individual farmers, in reality, the Hershey Company hired strikebreakers and coerced farmers to participate. Thus, under the ruse of a grassroots, independently organized backlash to the strike, Hershey used his manipulative power to quell the dissent against him. While so much of Hershey, Pennsylvania, from the services to the new factory to the connection to nature, painted a picture of a near-utopian community, they hid the true power and greed of Milton Hershey, who ultimately created a town and society that primarily benefited his own interests." End quote. Don't be fooled by this. It's not benevolence. It's a racket. It serves corporations and investors, and it puts the workers at incredible risk. Whatever pretty colors anyone wants to paint these company town arrangements, they are not benevolent. They are predatory and put far too much power in the hands of employers who already have more than they should. As usual, I've added resource links to the description. If you want to read them for yourself or use them as a springboard to finding other sources, feel free. I encourage you to look into this more if it's a topic that interests you, and if you have thoughts or knowledge about this topic you'd like to add to the comments, feel free. Book or resource recommendations are always welcome. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.